The severed length of pipe felt good in his fist, like a vicious extension of his own arm. There were many frustrations in his job, and now Giff was either going to work them off or compound them. With a hiss of exertion, he started to smash the pipe into the loudly chugging mound of machinery. The dense plates received yet another collection of minor dents, and the roused beast began to quiet down. Giff subdued the obstinate device with a few more volleys that were more for his benefit than that of the machine. Giff paused, wiped the accumulated sweat from his brow, and then spread it down the front of his grimy overalls. The fabric had more food stains on it than residue from manual labour, and more often than not he poured grease and oil onto his garments to make it look like he had actually been doing something in the maintenance corridors of the block. Giff was the repairman, general handyman for the middle of the tower, but in reality he had no idea what he was doing. Nevertheless, the residents of the block thought him capable, and he had managed to keep his job largely through luck. The various problems he was called upon to tackle generally rectified themselves somehow, and he took the credit. When they did not, he attacked the source, and if that did not work, he just said it was beyond repair. This was a hive world after all. The water distribution centre had been acting up all week. Some fool had let off a few grenades in one of the residential warehouses on floor 220. There had been a number of deaths, and the system had been unpredictable ever since. Giff laid the pipe onto his shoulder and turned a nearby tap. Warm, clear water came out instead of the black and foul-smelling ooze that everyone had been complaining about. He immediately flung the pipe away and let it clatter amongst several coiled nests of chain. He threw his arms up and turned to imaginary, adoring crowds. Giff waved and blew kisses, bowed and beamed with ebullient pride. "Aha! The one true mechanical genius of Kithkathis strikes again. Tech priests, stare upon your mighty lord of fixinization and envy me, my awesome talent." A brief staccato clatter broke his self-congratulatory speech. Giff whirled around and stared into the darkness. The room was quieter now, and the various strange machines that recycled and processed the water, the food, and the waste of the block could not hide the sounds of continuing movement. "Someone there?" he announced. There was a hesitant sound of covert steps in the shadows, and they were definitely not animal. Intruders were nothing new here, and Giff had encountered the odd vagrant in his private domain. The ducts and channels were warmer than the outside, plus there was no chance of dead rain. The homeless were generally harmless, but he hated having to clear up behind the filthy lumps. "This is authorised personnel only, so show off!" The signal of quick steps came from a new direction, and made him wonder if there was more than one. Giff was starting to get nervous. The steps were not exploratory, they were not trying to flee or hide, rather they seemed somehow predatory. "I ain't scared. I hang around in here all day and all night. I've seen things that have an inquisitor filling his pants. Some fool creeping around doesn't even bother me, so push off or you'll really get it." The movement stopped, and Giff caught a glimpse of something as it peeked up over a set of shelves and then darted off again. There was a small, almost inaudible chuckle that seemed to mock him and his deceleration of courage. "Right!" Giff slid his hand into his jacket and pulled out the pistol his father had acquired during his army days. It was a little old, but it worked well enough. At least it had the last time he used it. Giff suddenly wondered whether he had bothered to reload the magazine after that firefight broke out on the secondary mezzanine. "This here auto pistol is going to turn you into paste lesson you shift off and stop pestering me, get it?" Giff caught another hint of where the intruder was, and with the pistol cradled in both hands, he established a decent aim. "Enough of this hide and seek. You're a dead man." The contours of a small child revealed themselves when the infant moved a little to the side. The silhouette was unmistakable, and when she saw the gun, the girl quaked and with a whimper ducked back into cover. Giff gave a petulant sigh, gritted his teeth, and lowered the weapon. "Ah, damn it, you stupid little..." The figure merged deeper into the shadows, and he realised that he was terrifying the child. He did not really care, but if he drove the brat off, he would have to crawl around looking for the damn thing. It was just easier to act against his nature and be nice to the wretched little trespassing urchin. "Come on, it's okay. I won't hurt you. Stop skulking." The small figure moved a little, and Giff saw rows of wicked incisors. The flesh-rending fangs sparkled in the cursory light. "Emperor's trousers!" The creature moved forward a little, and brought a panicked response from Giff. The pistol bellowed and started to rattle in his hand. The pipes began to accept rapid clusters of holes. Water and steam instantly launched out, and the figure was lost amongst the escaping gas. A malignant titter from another area made it clear that he had not harmed it. Giff whirled and started to become dizzy as he continually spun around to try and find the thing and not let it sneak up on him. A creak made him jerk and fire recklessly at the source. The container danced backwards as it was pierced with bullets that tore apart the assorted spare parts within. He ceased fire and muttered a string of lurid obscenities. Giff decided to change tactics. He adopted a proud and stiff stance with the gun extended and a fist on his hip. He spoke with a deep, confident tone that with any luck would have the beast running off. "I'm warning you. Yes, I'm warning you." There was a vague patter of footfalls behind him, and suddenly the world turned over. Searing heat filled his throat, and then there was an unfelt impact to the floor. Giff tried to get up, but his body was not responding to his demands. He thought he saw a naked foot pass by his face, and then his decapitated body collapsed before him. His eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at the form that he had once been a quintessential part of. Red fonts gushed from the ragged teeth marks that marked the stump of the throat, and the limbs were twitching. Absurdly, his first thought was of how fat his belly looked. He had not realized how much weight he had gained since last year. Something grabbed his convulsing form and it slid from his view. Darkness was welling in the corners of his sight, and his brain was screaming impotently in its skull as it was starved of blood and air. Colour drained from the last remnants of his vision, and he started to hear the wet rip of parting flesh. Oblivion opened wide and accepted him into his chill embrace. For a short time Bavers had actually believed that the day had been going well. He could not think of any eventuality he had not covered, no clue he had not fully explored, or any possibility that had not been prepared for. Even the weather had been good, a long sunny spell, a few sparse straggly clouds that suggested something was amiss, but nothing significant. Then the dark rolling blanket of black and grey had swarmed from horizon to horizon, and with a thunderclap the deluge had begun. It was the kind of rain that seemed to punch through every defence and impart a sensation of being soaked. It felt as though he could be wearing Terminator armour, and yet still the rain would somehow manage to make him feel damp. Not that this rain could do anything but bring agony. He ran a finger along the side of his bolter and traced the contours and the seams. He wondered about the machines or humans who had helped put this weapon together. What dreams guided them? What hopes did they bear? It was strange that all of them should now be guarded by him and with the very fruits of their toil. The trail was virtually stagnant. If nothing came from this meeting, it meant that the quarry had eluded him and somehow managed to slip off-world. He hated that, hated it more than the source itself. Failure was the medium through which the darkness threatened humanity, and the slightest error in his unwavering path of devotion meant countless millions could die from an as-yet unpredicted outcome or eventuality. His task was a brutal one. It was not just harsh for those he hunted, and those who stood in his way, or were accidentally cut down in the crossfire, but it pillaged his own psyche as well. Sometimes Bavers had missed a whole coven and nothing had come of it, yet on other occasions he had thought he had quashed every single member, burned every book and treasonous unholy crystal. Then a short time later, a planetary holocaust had erupted amidst the population. Exterminatus. Was there any larger slap in the face for one such as he, any more blatant badge of failure? Hive worlds made him nervous. When he was on a backwater medieval world or some other underpopulated locale, the consequences of failure were less grievous. The slightest slip-up, the most minute mistake, the most fleeting blink of an eye on a hive world, and the hundreds and thousands, perhaps billions, would be soulless and bleeding in the streets. Kithkathis. It was a meaningless name on some half-forgotten ledger in the Adeptus Terra, a source for penal legion recruits and Adeptus Astartes hunts. However, where the rest of the Imperium paid little attention to this world, the Inquisition was ever vigilant. They had to glare into the seamy bowels that the other branches of humanity thought too mundane, too boring, too trivial, too forgettable, for it was in these lost corners of swarming human squalor that the blackest of seeds found nurture. Bavers closed his hand around the pistol grip of his bolter and let the forefinger delicately tickle the trigger. It had been a faithful machine, and he had treated it well. The proper incantations had been spoken, and he had done a few unofficial favours to ensure that the best tech priests said a few appeasing rites over the mechanism to sate its innate spirit. He had never jammed once, so he assumed that the Emperor did not mind these minor transgressions, and had blessed him with good fortune and mechanical efficiency for the killing. The complex ways of the tech priest intrigued and appealed to Bavas, but he lacked the mind to process their ancient lore. The Midstorum had been tempting him of late. If his position as an Inquisitor were not so vital, if he could even consider the option of taking a step back from the brink, from the front line, he might have been persuaded to seek transfer. However, his life, wants, comforts and goals meant nothing. He had a sacred duty. Nothing else mattered. Inquisitors were the iron-tempered will, the solid, unflinching backbone from which the meat and viscera of the Imperium hung. Bavas looked down the street and kept in the cover of the doorway. The metallic towers tore up at the sky, their highest peaks vanishing into the storm clouds. Sheets of rain descended and created a hazy middle distance where only the glow of neon signs and holographic adverts could be discerned from the nebulous veil. The citizens knew what was in the rain and had deserted the streets hours ago. No one wanted to face dead rain unless they had no other option, and Bavas did not. Dead rain. Everyone on Kithkathis had a reassuring sense of inevitable futility about it, as though the agonizing death was welcomed, for it would be their one sure way out of this miserable place. As one part lamentation, one part hopeful prayer, they'd say, "Dead rain, one day it gets us all." He spied a small animal scampering from one pile of refuse to another. He was unfamiliar with the species, and watched with a sense of intrigue as it squeaked softly, while its pale skin sizzled and burned. The tiny beast tried to find shelter, but it soon slowed and then dropped onto its side. Its jaws stretched wide as though it was seeking salvation with one final breath, and then it lay still. The skin started to slough away, and the meat of the cadaver started to liquefy. The industrial byproducts falling from the sky would soon strip it to the bone, and rob the other scavenging beasts of any morsel to exploit. Bavas stepped out into the rain, and kept himself deep within the dense folds of his overcoat. The black and impervious fabric ran with droplets, and his wide-brimmed hat drooped a little at the edges under the weight of the toxic water. His goggles and respirator kept spray and fume from his face as he turned and started to wander towards his goal. He looked over his physique as it was reflected in the barred windows of the various isolated shops. Most had closed when the weather sats had detected the deadly rain closing in from the coast, but a few remained stubbornly open. Bavas had always wished he were taller. He was not short, but he did not have the impressive and intimidating height that he yearned to possess. He had tirelessly developed his physique to compensate, and his dense arrays of muscles made his form wide and potent. His features had once been youthful, but the things he had seen and the deeds he had done had left eyes that were dull and dark, with deep creases running all about a pale and sullen face. Handsome, ugly, it didn't matter. People responded to his orders because of threat, intimidation, or weaponry, not out of something as obsolete as lust. The Imperium was his parent, his duty was his wife, and his bolter was his mistress. He needed nothing else, and considered his life rich and complete because of them. Likewise, the way he clothed himself, simple, straightforward, like his duty. No ornamentation, no baroque decorative fancies and heraldry. Sometimes such things had their place, but he often preferred to work from the shadows, stripped down to the essentials, lurking, prowling, until the time came to pounce. Bavas entered a small pedestrian tunnel, and with his aim leading the way, he approached the small maintenance hatch that was set about halfway down it. The lights were all broken, and ample shadows cloaked the passage. There was a junction up ahead, and he could see a small gang of children. They were currently relishing a fistfight that they had arranged between two impoverished vagrants, and were absorbed by the brutal spectacle. Their yells and shouts of encouragement provided added cover as he slipped into the deepest pools of darkness and stepped before the hatch. The plasteel lock had been cut through with a powerful laser, and the hatch was now slightly ajar. This was unexpected, and it caused Bavas to pause. A moment later, commitment returned, and he kicked the portal in. As it flew back, he leapt forward and cast his aim and eye across the interior. The figure within whirled and hoisted a pair of auto-pistols at Bavas. The man was dressed in the same protective outfit as he, and at his feet was sprawled a couple of naked bodies. The two men instantly recognized each other and slowly eased their grip upon the triggers. "Bavas," acknowledged the fellow Inquisitor. "Gant," he gruffly stated by way of a reply. "I told you our quarry would unite." Suck on a chainsaw, brother, said Bavas. Many a heretic has no doubt prayed for that, but to our current dilemma, one wonders what else I am right about. Gant had a penchant for gloating that Bavas found exceedingly irritating. Rather than reply, he chose to scan the interior. The small room was replete with derelict tools and spare parts for the maintenance of the block. None of it had been used in countless decades. A small circular passage stretched off into the distance, and an occasional flickering bulb lit the otherwise gloomy length. How fresh? Asked Bavas once his eyes had returned to the cadavers. As he had customised to the new level of light, he could see scratch and bite marks all over the bared skin. There was also a wide pool of crimson spread beneath them. Gant kicked one of them over and said, "About an hour, maybe less." The slack form rolled over, and its chest yawned wide like the toothless grin of a hag. The ribs had been hauled open, and every organ had been stolen. The contorted, frozen expression of the corpse revealed that they had been alive during this process. "If they are being sloppy like this, they must be getting ready to move on again," said Bavas. Gant nodded. "So we'd best move quickly," and began to trot off down the corridor. Bavas took one more look at the bodies and gave chase. The possessed had indulged their foul whims with the citizens and left them to rot. On previous occasions they had taken the time to dispose of or at least conceal the cadavers. The fact that they were acting and just ignoring the leftovers suggested flight was imminent. They simply just didn't care anymore. Bavas had unearthed evidence of a small cult on Briox. They had slipped the noose he had been preparing when local forces acted rashly and broke cover before they could trap them all. Now that he had traced them to Kithkathis, he would not repeat the same error. Even so, it was dangerous to face such fell entities alone, so he had stationed a few squads of Imperial army at the primary escape routes from this network of service tunnels. If all else failed, he could at least try to flush the beasts into their doom. He had encountered Gant when the Inquisitor had been seeking possessed. It meant that the cult had re-established itself and was conducting rites to drag the enemy from the warp and dress it in supplicant flesh. They had no idea as to how many were currently abroad on the planet, and that made the situation grave. The cult responsible for the deed had already been dealt with. A few melter bombs tossed into their shrine as they cavorted and flaunted decency successfully cleansed them all in one, but the possessed had not been present. Their appetites lay beyond what the cult could offer. Reports of missing persons, tales of monsters from raving transients, and the odd corpse had narrowed the search to this very precise area. Now that it had been sealed off, it was time to end the pestilent presence that befouled this world. The Inquisitors moved into a larger area where massive pipes lanced down through the room and created a strange metallic grove. The chains of a few winches rattled malevolently in the breeze of a fan, and the sound of munching could be heard coming from the shadows. Gant instantly opened fire on the moist noise. The rapid muzzle flashes permeated the dark, and they caught a glimpse of something humanoid lurking behind a pile of old canisters. Scintillating bursts spat from the metal containers as the rounds chewed on them. The vague shape gave a growling hiss and instantly vanished into a nearby chute, a visceral string still dangling from his jaws. Bavas was not so hasty, and checked the rest of the room to ensure that they were not in an ambush. There were no other sounds of life, so he closed upon the last location of the beast. Chewed offal and copious splashes of blood were all that remained. Bavas pulled out a torch, flicked it on, and aimed the narrow beam into the pipe. He could hear the scuttling scamper of their prey echoing within. "Anything?" asked Gant. The clatter of 2 spent magazines sounded behind him as the Inquisitor reloaded. "No, but we have a blood trail. It might lead us to their nest. If they have one." Clipping the torch to the side of his weapon, Bavas moved in with his bolter kept forward. The restricted space forced him to remain hunched and off balance, but he was not about to let the fiend get away if he could help it. His breath resounded softly within the tunnel, and as they continued to trace the specks and smears of red, they started to hear the rain as it beat upon the exterior. They were leaving the mid-levels of the block and entering areas where the tunnels reached across the great spaces between the towers. It was now clear how the beasts had managed to conduct their homicidal hobby on such a wide scale. Bavas had thought the network large, but not to this extent. In several places, the caustic drizzle had managed to eat through a poorly manufactured seam. The gaps permitted the morose signal of dripping to roll along the passages, and it piqued their trepidation. Steadying his uneven breath, Bavas continued onward. There was more to fear here than just ominous sound. He was facing demonic nightmares skulking in traitorous human tissue. He paused to nudge a half-eaten strand of kidney aside with his boot. The organ was stiff, dry, old. They were getting closer. This was their hunting ground. They could see that a section of floor was missing up ahead, and the hole allowed the bright lights of the city to rise up and illuminate that section of chute. Bavis took a glance over the lip and saw the well drop away for 100 stories. Lofty roads and paths crisscrossed between the towers and almost hid the distant view of the ground. Acting with care, they traversed the obstacle. The vaguely pliant nature of the dissolved metal was unnerving when it gave slightly under their feet. The structure held, though, and they continued into the blackness. After what seemed like hours of trudging carefully along with an unknown hazard waiting for them with every step, they finally emerged into a small air processing plant. The machines were rusted, dented, and dead. The skylights had been eaten away and now let columns of rain descend and create deep puddles across the buckled and uneven floor. Bavis moved the torch beam across the strange, contorted piles of archaic debris and located a hunched form. The naked skin of the girl was smeared with blood, and she was holding her stomach. The girl was sobbing and shuddering with a mixture of acute shock and physical trauma. Gant stepped forward and approached her, his pistol strayed to the side so he could shred any possible attacker that might be waiting to pounce. "Where did it go? Tell me," he demanded. Bavis saw a slim red coil of fresh meat upon an exposed finger and realized the truth. "Gant, no!" he roared, but it was too late. The girl launched up and around. The corners of her mouth extended to her slightly pointed ears, and the unnatural maw was filled with jewelled rows of hooked fangs. Her eyes were large and bulbous, and the emerald orbs glowed with a sickly luminescence. The digits of each hand started to melt and create a pair of conjoined fingers that immediately began to elongate. Gant jerked up his aim, but the abomination was incredibly fast and was on him before he could fire. Its warped hands grabbed his coat and the naked form whirled around. Gant was hurled aside, but the creature did not release its grip. The dense fabric parted and peeled from his body. The rags were left in the creature's hands and Gant hurtled aside before slamming into an inert power node. The deep clang of flesh against metal sounded and he dropped back, collapsing into a puddle. Gant instantly arched up and screamed as the deadly liquid gnawed through his attire and then began to energetically dissolve his skin. He instinctively rolled aside, but this only soaked his form in the acidic waste. With the keening holler of his fellow inquisitor filling his ears, Bavis opened fire. The bolter kicked against his shoulder and shook his bones as heavy explosive rounds pounded the grinning aberration. The creature giggled and cocked its head aside. It seemed to savour Gant's anguish while remaining deliberately oblivious of Bavis's pernicious assault. The barrage began to have an effect. Bolter fire tore open its left shoulder clear down to the bone. A round drilled into its thigh and detonated to make the skin swell like a pustule before it erupted and sent gore across the ground. A few deep cuts were applied across the naked chest, and the last of the magazine clipped its right eye. The round scooped out the orb and spattered it upon the adjacent machinery. "Tee-hee-hee, how bad of me," it shrieked, and the fiend began to dance a little jig with its hands held high over its head. Bavis crushed his fear and ejected the clip. He delved into a pocket and slammed a fresh one home while Gant's howls degenerated into gurgling hisses. The vapours and liquid were eating away his vocal cords, and the stink of burning flesh was overpowering. It stung Bavis's eyes, even through the protective goggles. Gant was mercifully obscured from easy view by a curling plume of acrid steam and smoke. He continued to flounder as he tried to escape the foe that was eating away at him from all directions. The moment Bavis recommenced firing, the creature dashed towards him with hands outstretched. Rounds punched and pummeled the unnaturally dense hide and inflicted more cuts and gashes, but nothing more significant than that. At the last possible moment, Bavis ducked down and swung the bolter around like a club. The length slammed into the stomach of the advancing beast and folded it at the middle. It halted and gave a merry titter by way of response. Still bent upon his weapon, the beast looked up at him with its one glowing eye. Before it could speak, Bavis tugged the bolter out and crashed the butt into the exposed features. The warped face whirled away from the force of the blow, and a brief spurt of red left its lips. The fiend immediately spun back to greet Bavis with a leering smirk. Bavis tried to raise the weapon and fire on the creature, but it acted with a celerity he could not hope to match. A fist swung up and clipped him under the chin. His respirator shattered, and his gaze was suddenly flicked to the ceiling. He tottered back as his senses reeled from the grievous ferocity of the strike. Hands grabbed him and hurled him around. His back was slammed to the wall, and he was pinned there by hands that felt like they had the might of a power glove in each of them. The beast leaned in, and Bavas beheld a long pastel tongue that slipped from its jaws and lapped over the front of his goggles. His heart skipped a beat as he watched the grotesque organ smear itself across the transparent material. "Kiss, kiss," it said with a sibilant and licentious purr. Bavas caught sight of the ranks of deadly fangs waiting behind the tongue and jerked his head up and away from the slithering oral tentacle. With his broken respirator no longer providing a barricade, he sank his own teeth into the organ and clenched his jaws together with such ferocity that he felt ligaments tear beneath his cheek. The creature gave a brief pip of surprised distress, and its grip eased a fraction. Bavas called upon all of his strength and hurled an uppercut into the bottom jaw of the abomination. The maw slammed shut and cut the tongue off at the root. The amputated organ fell to the floor with a soft splat, and the creature gave its first genuine sound of pain. The sputtered mule gave Bavas a fresh wave of encouragement. With as much speed as he could, he hooked a leg around those of the creature and shoved into its chest. There was a startled gasp, and the beast dropped to the floor. "I killed your little friend, and I'll kill you too," it shrieked with annoyance. Bavas wasted no time and grabbed his bolter. The moment it was in his hand, he dove forward and jammed the muzzle into the mouth of the beast. The stump of the tongue pawed at the weapon, and the fiend sought to rise. "I only have one friend, spawn of evil. Say hello to it." The creature's lone eye bulged with alarm before the entire roof of its head opened up. The contents charged out to create a wanton collage of organic carnage across the floor, and a drastic throe ran through the anatomy of the beast. The monster grabbed the gun and tried to pull it out. Bavas held tight and placed his own weight onto it to defeat the wicked strength that filled the beast's limbs. He wiggled and swung himself upon the bolter as successive rounds continued to excavate the shattered cranium. Scorched chunks of meat and droplets of blood rained down upon him. Then the magazine ran empty with a hollow click, and then the fiend sagged. Bavas cast himself back onto his feet, grabbed another clip, and proceeded to empty it into the body. He had seen a host regenerate before his very eyes and was not about to let it happen here. The body twitched and danced as it disintegrated under the relentless stab of heavy explosive rounds. When he had drained the clip, the body was scarcely recognizable as human. A faint hint of pastel-coloured smoke began to curl up amidst the steam that was emanating from exposed hot viscera. It briefly swirled, gave a disgruntled hiss, and then dissipated. The fiend had been defeated. It seemed that there had been only one of them, but he would have to continue his investigation to make sure. An inquisitor had been lost. He had to ensure that Gant's sacrifice was not a pointless one. Bavas slipped his last magazine into the bolter, removed his broken respirator, and went to Gant. The body was in two separate pieces, and the steam rising from them stung his exposed skin. A lumpy pool of pink slime now divided Gant's sternum from his hips. Avoiding the rain that continued to pelt the ooze, Bavas retrieved Gant's mask and slipped it on. He took a refreshingly pure breath and stared down at the dissolving dregs of the corpse as it lay in the toxic rain. The dead rain indeed. One day it takes us all. Part prayer, part lamentation. This was the fate of all inquisitors, to one day fall in the fight to preserve humanity.